I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Have you ever heard of spontaneous remissions when people recover from seemingly terminal diseases? Are they real? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Many physicians have been taught that spontaneous remissions are extremely rare and hard to study. Does that mean there's nothing we can learn from these extraordinary cases?
Our guest today, Dr. Jeffrey Rediger, has been studying spontaneous healing for many years.
How much of spontaneous remission is explainable, and how much is beyond our comprehension? His book is Cured, The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the lessons we can learn from people who have made amazing recoveries.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, COVID-19 remains mysterious. Case rates have fluctuated widely from country to country with no obvious explanation. This week, Austria, Germany, France, Poland, and the Netherlands are up dramatically. Japan, on the other hand, has seen case rates fall to historic lows. 3 months ago, the country was reporting nearly 23,000 cases daily. Now it's down to less than 200. Tokyo, with a population of 14 million, had only 16 cases last Friday. That compares to more than 1,000 cases in Los Angeles County with a population of 10 million people. What could account for the rapid reduction in COVID cases in Japan? Geneticists there have a hypothesis. They propose that the Delta variant outcompeted all other variants of COVID-19. Then it mutated in a way that reduced its ability to replicate and evolve. Professor Inoue at the National Institute of Genetics in Mishima, Japan, suggests that this new version of SARS-2 has become a faulty virus that can't copy itself and is on a road to self-destruction in Japan. This is what happened to the original SARS virus outbreak in 2003. Other scientists attribute the drop in cases to a 75% vaccination rate in Japan and nearly universal use of face masks.
The United States is experiencing a resurgence in cases. That was not entirely unexpected, given that cold weather tends to drive people together indoors. There's another alarming consequence of COVID-19. Many people who are no longer acutely ill are still suffering symptoms of long COVID. One common complaint is an inability to smell. A new study published in JAMA Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery reports that between 700,000 and 1.6 million Americans are now suffering from chronic olfactory dysfunction because of a COVID-19 infection. In other words, their sense of smell is impaired. The researchers suggest that this may be a gross underestimate. If so, it would represent a serious public health concern.
When do you go to sleep? Are you a night owl or an early bird? The answer to that question may affect your risk for cardiovascular disease. That's the conclusion of a new study in the European Heart Journal, Digital Health. Investigators collected data from more than 88,000 individuals in the UK Biobank database. The volunteers each wore an accelerometer for a week to measure activity and sleep time. The scientists then followed up on their health status for more than 5 years. People who went to bed between 10 and 11 p.m. had the lowest risk of heart attacks, strokes, and other cardiovascular complications. Those who waited until after midnight before they slept, and also those who turned in before 10, had higher risks. This correlation is especially marked in women. The study could not determine if it's late bedtime per se or other characteristics of night owls that might increase their risk. People with later bedtimes tend to be heavier, which is also linked to cardiovascular problems.
Intermittent fasting has become trendy. Now, a study from Intermountain Healthcare Heart Institute in Salt Lake City demonstrates that this practice has metabolic benefits. The study recruited 67 people who had type 2 diabetes or at least one feature of metabolic syndrome. This condition is a marker for higher risk of heart disease. It includes a big belly, elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance, increased blood pressure, high triglycerides, and low HDL cholesterol. Half the participants in the trial were assigned to a water-only fast twice a week for the first month, and then once a week for the next 5 months. The other half did not change their eating patterns. Those who fasted had less insulin resistance and fewer markers of metabolic syndrome. They also had less inflammation. Previous research has shown that intermittent fasting can help people lose weight and reduce their chances of heart disease. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Today, we're going to learn about spontaneous recoveries. Some people call them miracles. Others deny they exist at all. What are we to make of these phenomena?
Is there any science to explain spontaneous healing from serious illness? Doctors often say such events are too rare to study. Our guest disagrees.
To learn more, we turn to Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a psychiatrist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, the medical director of McLean SC Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital, and the chief of behavioral medicine at Caritas Good Samaritan Medical Center. He's the author of Cured, the life-changing science of spontaneous healing.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Jeffrey Rediger.
Thank you for having me here.
Dr. Rediger, your book has a subtitle, The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing. And I'd like to get a definition to start with, please. What do you mean by spontaneous remission or spontaneous healing?
That's a great question, Joe. Spontaneous remission is what we call unexpected recoveries in medicine. And if you're on the science side, you call these spontaneous remissions, and we're taught in medical school that these events don't have any medical value, that they're just flukes with no scientific value. If you're on the spiritual or religious side, you tend to call these events miracles or spiritual healing. What's fascinating from my perspective is that all of these terms are black boxes, and we've never used the tools of science to unpack what's really going on here.
One of the reasons that science, I think, hasn't studied this phenomenon of spontaneous healing is doctors say, oh, it's so rare, it's completely unpredictable.
Inexplicable.
And consequently, you can't study it in a clinical trial. So is it as rare as they think?
That's a great question. It appears to be a lot more common than we expect. It's outside of our paradigm. It's not the way we are taught to perceive things. What I've been told over and over by people is that the medical establishment wasn't interested in their stories and in their pathway to recovery. And I think historically doctors have been concerned about publishing these things because they do occur outside of the paradigm of how we've been taught to think about health and well-being and healing. So when I've talked to rooms of doctors, I've asked, has anybody ever seen an unexpected healing or a spontaneous remission in the practice? Many doctors will raise their hands that they've seen these over time. But then when you then ask if they have published their findings, no one has. And of all the people I've interviewed, no one's findings have ever been published in a medical journal. So
wow.
I do believe that these things occur, and these stories are buried in our culture without a voice.
Well, why do you think medicine finds these stories so disquieting? Why do we use the term, oh, it's a fluke? We can't study it. And what's more, what I find really astonishing is that I've heard many times that when someone gets over, is healed, or perhaps we can even use the word cured, of what should have been a fatal condition, I've heard that, some physicians say, well, it was a misdiagnosis. They didn't really have lung cancer after all.
Pancreatic cancer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that the current era, currently concluding in our culture, has been an era of diseases and medications. Doctors are taught to diagnose diseases and prescribe medications. And I think that's been a very important stage in the evolution of medicine and culture. That was really the set of questions that founded the current era. The ability to recognize the signs and symptoms of one illness and distinguish that from the signs and symptoms of another illness was a very important part of the industrial era and coming to terms with naming diseases. But that's a very different set of questions when it comes to what it means to study health and well-being and how people heal. Those are not questions that as doctors we're really taught to ask. It seems it doesn't make a lot of sense perhaps to consider that we aren't taught to study health and well-being and how people heal. But I think that's the new era facing us, and that's what's very exciting. In the last 20 years, there's been growing momentum in medicine and in our culture to really want to study health, study well-being, to study how people heal. That's a very different set of questions, and that brings spontaneous remission into the fold of what now can be studied. Spontaneous remission is really the flagship for healing and well-being.
Dr. Rediger, you have many stories in this book, Cured, about people who have experienced spontaneous healing. One runs throughout the book. You introduce us to Claire in the introduction, and you conclude the conclusion with Claire. Can you please tell us about Claire Hazer, her diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, which is usually a deadly diagnosis, and how did Claire's story play out?
That's a great question. I've learned so much from Claire. She's been a true teacher for me in this whole area, just like all these people I've studied. It's not the doctors and medications that got these people better. These people took massive responsibility for their health and well-being at every level. She was diagnosed by biopsy in 2008 with the worst form of pancreatic cancer, pancreatic adenocarcinoma. It's a death sentence, and she expected to die within a matter of months. And she's a very common sense person. She values science and typically follows doctors' recommendations. But as she scanned the internet and spent night after night looking through the possibilities for herself, what kinds of treatment to proceed with, whether the Whipple surgery, which would remove a significant part of her abdomen, was really the best course for her, she decided that for her, in her particular situation, the next best step for her was not to go through surgery and then spend the next short months of her life in doctor's offices with other people who are going to die. She decided in her case that she was going to spend time with those she loved and prepare to die, and that's what she did. And then she didn't die. And the months stretched into more months and then into years. She has a website that I think is a great example of what people do in these kinds of situations. Her website is livingwithpancreaticcancer.com, and it's just a common sense approach to thinking about nutrition, thinking about changing her relationship with stress, thinking about who she is as a person, what does it mean to heal and forgive. And it's just a great window into what I see over and over with these people. And so now, here we are, 2019. She has continued to be a magnificent teacher for me of the possibilities that lie latent within all of us.
Dr. Rediger, I can hear a lot of our physician listeners going, but, Dr. Rediger, you don't want to give people false hope. The idea that they can somehow survive a diagnosis like pancreatic cancer. And Terry, many years ago, we interviewed a scientist who had a cancer himself. I think it was a glioblastoma. And he said, yes, but we also don't want to give people false hopelessness. He lived many years beyond the prognosis, in part by doing exactly what you're describing, changing his stress level, changing his diet, changing his relationship to people around him. So help us understand the difference between false hope and false hopelessness.
That's a really important question. As doctors, we are taught to not give false hope, and I think that's really important. People are suffering with real diseases, and the implications are massive for how this impacts themselves and their families and loved ones. However, we have to understand that doctors are taught to look at averages. Our current scientific model is built around looking at what's average, and things are grouped around the mean. And that's important to understand. It's important to understand that the average trajectory for a person's particular illness can be a certain number of months or a certain number of years, and just to know what you're dealing with. But we also have to remember that every person has their own story, and it's an unrepeatable, unique story, and that story is typically not examined in medicine. It's actually excluded. And that story has a lot to do with where a person's trajectory will go. And if a person's interested in changing that trajectory, we all know that we need hope. We need to know that there are possibilities. We are this dual nature where we are biological beings and we are also psychological and even spiritual beings. And there's a larger possibility that can be built from looking at what's possible. If I was ill, I would want to know what the average person does, but I also would want to know what the ultimate achievers in health did and have done, because what they're doing is so fundamentally different than just simply taking a medication and then waiting for the next step. So your question's good. We have to provide possibilities of hope for people. We need a medicine of hope and possibility.
You're listening to Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a psychiatrist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. Dr. Rediger is also chief of behavioral medicine at Caritas Good Samaritan Medical Center. His book is Cured: The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing.
After the break, we'll learn about Dr. William Coley and how his innovative treatment a century ago can help us understand the immune system.
A serious diagnosis creates a lot of stress. How does this affect the body's ability to heal itself?
You'll hear about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and how the vagus nerve responds to stress.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements. Cocoflavanols are among the most well-studied plant-based nutrients, backed by 20 years of scientific research.
CocoVia Cardio Health is available in capsules or powder, providing 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols daily. This supports better blood flow and vascular performance.
CocoVia also offers Memory Plus, supplements with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols. This product is backed by 4 different clinical studies demonstrating significant improvement in several aspects of memory.
CocoVia flavanols are derived from real cocoa beans. They offer you all the benefits of chocolate without the sugar. More information at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, the maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at CocoVia, that's CocoVia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
Today, our topic is the science of spontaneous remission. How does stress impact the body's ability to heal?
Our guest is Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a psychiatrist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. He's also chief of behavioral medicine at Caritas Good Samaritan Medical Center. His book is Cured, The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing.
Dr. Rediger, I'd like to ask you about Dr. William Coley, because here was a cancer physician. He specialized in sarcoma, a very deadly kind of cancer even today, and yet he had come up with a kind of treatment that I suspect in his day was perceived as maybe even hocus pocus, because we didn't know very much about the immune system. Now we could actually explain why he had such success in treating so many sarcoma patients with what was referred to as Coley's toxin. Maybe some of the spontaneous healing, we just don't understand why it's happening or how the immune system is working. And it's not fluke, it's not weird, it's just we don't understand what's going on in the body.
Right. Well, you raise a huge and fascinating issue, and with your background in pharmacy and medications, you know a lot of this history. It is a fascinating story. William Coley was a brilliant doctor. He's called the father of immunology, of immunotherapy, and he was, you could say, ahead of his time. He was the first person that we know in Western medicine who tried to use the immune system to battle disease. The immune system is this magnificent, complex army with all kinds of battalions and sub-battalions and very specialized units that can go in and with different approaches can tag a mutating cell that's going to become cancer and get rid of the cell. It can do all these brilliant things that are so much more sophisticated than our current medications. And so with Bessie, the first sarcoma patient that he worked with and that launched this inquiry for him, as he investigated this phenomenon, he began to see that some of the people who got better had a sharp fever spike prior to their spontaneous remission. And so he began to investigate, is there something about activating the immune system that results in a fever that then just provides superpowers to the immune system and kicks out the tumor? Because tumors are taken care of and treated by the immune system. So when people get cancer, at one level, that's a failure of the immune system. But Coley was ahead of his time, and it was right at the time when we were starting to realize the marvels of medications, insulin, antibiotics, these really powerful ways of treating infections and cancer. And so we developed a whole approach, for example, called chemotherapy. And chemotherapy historically has been about suppressing the immune system. And so doctors are taught to suppress the immune system, and in doing so, trying to basically go after the cancer, and you try to kill the cancer before you kill the person, basically. These chemotherapy agents are very toxic usually, especially the older traditional ones, and the effort has been to basically kill the cancer before you kill the person by suppressing the immune system. And doctors are also taught to give Tylenol or Advil to help bring down the fever when people have fevers instead of activating the immune system. And so now, as a result of going back and looking at Dr. Coley's work and other really bright investigators and doctors, we're starting to see the rise of immunotherapy, which tries to galvanize and activate the immune system instead of suppressing it. And that is very promising for the medications that will be developed over the next few decades, because it's a very different approach than suppressing the immune system.
How do the cases that you have looked at in Cured help us understand what's going on with the immune system?
Well, they're a really good window into a fully functional immune system. There's a lot of factors that go into creating an immune system. Nutrition is a big one, and I'm sorry to say that most of us as doctors and nutritionists, we are given a lot of misinformation, I believe, about genuine nutrition and nutritional density. There's a lot of influence from food groups and industry groups that's created our understanding of nutrition over time. And so it's been helpful for me to study these people with remarkable recoveries and see how they approach nutrition. That's one factor that creates our immune system. Another factor is our relationship with stress. Is stress a difficult thing for us where it often becomes toxic, or are the stressors in our life overwhelming us in a way that it's causing us to bathe our bodies in stress hormones much of the time in a way that affects our physiology and affects the vitality of the immune system? There's a lot of issues with that as well. And so creating a healthy, vital, robust immune system is something that these individuals with their remarkable recoveries have been teaching me, and it's really been important for me to see all of this from that perspective.
And Dr. Rediger, one of the great challenges for patients when they're given a really devastating diagnosis, whether it be cancer, whether it be a neurological condition such as Parkinson's disease or ALS, it is the stress level goes through the stratosphere.
Yeah.
If somebody says, well, you have lung cancer, or you have breast cancer, I mean, your body goes into a fight or flight mode, I suspect. And the healthcare system doesn't seem very well prepared to help them deal with that stress. And so if stress is such a negative factor, I would think that healers, physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, PAs, all of the people who are involved in helping patients would want to figure out ways to help people deal with that initial stress and then that ongoing low level of stress if it's such an important factor in the healing process.
Absolutely true. Is there a particular question in there that you want me to answer?
The question is, how can we make your colleagues more aware of the importance of stress in the prognosis and the ultimate outcome? And then how can we get the healthcare system to start addressing this really important fundamental process?
That's a great question. I think that as medical professionals, we all need to understand the human dimensions of what's going on for people. Stress is a big part of what people bring into the clinics where they see doctors. It's 85% of what contributes in a massive way to inpatient hospitalizations. Stress is what's going on, but it's not what we often ask about or are trained to see. We're trained to look at the disease process, and yet the possibilities for healing and really helping are completely in the patient's story and what's really going on for them. I can tell you a short story about the power of that if you would like.
Please do.
So it wasn't that long ago that a 64-year-old woman came into the emergency room at one of the hospitals where I work, and she had chest pain. And so there's a procedure that you're put through when a person comes into the emergency room with chest pain. And so she was enrolled in that pathway of cardiac catheterization and EKG and all that. It turns out that they didn't find a heart problem. And they thought, well, maybe we better get Dr. Rediger involved. Maybe this is a panic attack, because panic attacks can present with overwhelming chest pain and a sense of dread, and a person can actually feel like they're going to die. So I walk into the room and sit down at the bedside and ask her if she's had some stress in her life recently. It turns out that this 64-year-old woman had been told by her husband the day before that he was leaving and moving to Florida. She had been with him since age 15. It's the only man that she'd ever known. And she was devastated by this. She couldn't imagine what was happening to her. She had no categories to even begin coping with this. And so as a result, she came in with chest pain the next day. I really wanted her to get some help for this, to begin dealing with the stress of what she was facing. And she looked at me and she said, I'm an old school Catholic. I'm just not going to do that. That's not what this is about. A month later, she was back in the emergency room, again with chest pain, and this time she had atrial fibrillation, which is a dangerous cardiac rhythm, and now she's on medications for the rest of her life. I can't prove that the stress of losing her husband and her marriage and her life as she knew it caused her heart problem, but I see this kind of thing all the time. I see people come into the emergency room after a fight with their mother or their loved one, and they end up with a relapse of a chronic medical condition that results in a lot of physical pain for them. I see these kinds of things all the time, and I can tell you the story of the patient, the person's life, has a massive role to play in what's going on in their physical bodies.
And I think cardiologists are gradually beginning to recognize that. We've heard of something called broken heart syndrome, which I think is a stress response primarily. But It's real cardiology.
Yes, it is. It's a really good point. It's absolutely true. What goes on in our minds and our bodies plays a huge role in what we experience. I think, to be completely honest, I believe how we feel about ourselves at a deep level and how we feel about the friendliness or lack of friendliness in the universe, whether we feel alone or not. All of these, the deep conscious and subconscious emotions play a large role in what eventuates as health or illness in our bodies.
Dr. Rediger, I'm going to get technical for a moment because you write in Cured about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system responses. Has a lot to do with what we're talking about, stress and how our bodies react. This is the kind of language that Joe, as a pharmacologist, just loves. But me, I'm an anthropologist. Please explain it in ways that an anthropologist could understand.
And please mention something about the vagus nerve.
That's great. I really appreciate the question. So we have these complex, highly evolved nervous systems. One part of our nervous system, called the sympathetic nervous system, has played a huge role in our evolution over many millennia in helping us recognize threats in our environments. If you're on the savannas of Africa and there's a tiger, you want to see that tiger first before it sees you, and you want to not ask how it's feeling or ask how you're feeling. You want to be hightailing it for the first tree nearby. And that sympathetic nervous system is wired for fight or flight or freeze. And if you look through the animal and human kingdom, you see that's very much the kinds of responses we all tend to have when there's a threat. And when that happens, the blood in our bodies is shunted towards muscles, towards the parts of our bodies that need quick action and decision-making. And that involves the secretion of a lot of stress hormones like cortisol. On the other hand, we have this parasympathetic mode within us. It's a very different aspect of our nervous system, and that's the state we want to be in most of the time, where our stress hormones are not being highly secreted, where we are relaxed, where we can engage with the people around us. The vagus nerve is the superhighway for the parasympathetic nervous system in our bodies. It snakes through our entire bodies. It touches most of our organs. It is the nerves that crinkle the eyes and put a light in the eyes when you're making contact with somebody you care about, and that help you smile and make contact with a person. It activates the cranial nerves and helps you relax and connect with people and with life in a way that is not stressful. And when your body is in a parasympathetic state, your body is free to heal. There's a lot of different cell types and proteins that are all directed in the direction of healing and regenerating, revitalizing the body. A lot of us live in chronic fight or flight. We've been trained to recognize the threat on the horizon first. 10 times more bad news is reported than good news. And even though there's a lot of wonderful things going on in the world, we don't pay as much attention to those, and our media doesn't pay as much attention to those because it's so wired on what is the problem out there that I need to recognize first. Well, we don't have tigers trying to get us on the horizon anymore. Our threats are more because we're stressed because we're sitting in traffic, or we've got to make a lot of decisions about the care of our children or bills and that sort of thing, and the threats are not near as immediate. And so learning how to advance our nervous system in a way that we can connect with ourselves and others and not feel so threatened and causing the secretion of all these stress hormones is a critical part of our health and healing and of our evolution as human beings. It turns out that the Origin of Species that Darwin wrote, this classic text, described a lot about our evolution as human beings and all that. But in some of his writings, it turns out that he really talked about the importance of love and connection being more important than survival of the fittest. And I'd have to pull back the details of how many times he talked about survival of the fittest in his later work, which is very little, and how much more he talked about how we are really wired for love and connection. And I think that's something that requires some reinterpretation of our understanding of Darwin's contribution to us and our understanding. We can reinterpret his classic work for our own time in a way that helps us move the dial in terms of next steps for us in our own efforts to create a more activated vagus nerve and realize that love and connection actually helps solve problems more than fight or flight does.
You're listening to Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a psychiatrist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. Dr. Rediger is Chief of Behavioral Medicine at Caritas Good Samaritan Medical Center. His book is Cured, The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing.
And Terry, there really is a condition called broken heart syndrome.
That's right. It has a technical term, Takotsubo. It comes from Japanese, and it describes an octopus trap, which is the shape of the heart on the sonogram.
After the break, we'll find out how to balance the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.
How do you do that?
Triggering the relaxation response can be helpful.
You'll hear about some of the ultimate achievers in health that Dr. Rediger has studied.
What lessons do their stories hold for the rest of us?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic supplements. These supplements are made in the USA with high-quality, sustainably sourced ingredients.
Originally developed in Germany, Kaya Biotics offers 3 different formulations with 15 carefully selected strains of bacteria. These are designed to increase the diversity of your gut flora and support your immune system. More information at kayabiotics.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Coco Via, offering plant-based nutrients in the form of cocoa flavanols for brain and heart health. Online at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. KAYABIOTICS.com.
Are there practical steps people can take to enhance the healing process, especially when faced with a dire diagnosis? Can researchers learn from cases of spontaneous recovery?
Today we're talking with Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a psychiatrist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. He's also Chief of Behavioral Medicine at Caritas Good Samaritan Medical Center. Dr. Rediger has written Cured, the Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing.
Dr. Rediger, you've been discussing the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight versus the more relaxed, more calm, more loving side of our nervous system. And all of your colleagues, I mean, every physician is trained about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and yet putting that into practice, interacting with patients, and somehow, shall we say, dampening down that sympathetic nervous system with the epinephrine and the norepinephrine and the cortisol levels, and boosting the parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve, the acetylcholine side of things. How can we do that? One of your colleagues, Dr. Benson at Harvard, has been certainly writing about the relaxation response. But I think most physicians, they're so busy, they don't have time. They haven't really been trained in this. So how do we encourage your colleagues, and then how do we also encourage people to learn how to activate that parasympathetic nervous system?
Great question. So stress is a big part of all of our lives, and it comes in lots of different forms, and what's stressful for one person is not stressful for another. What I think is important to understand is that it's our relationship with stress that's critical. When I was a wilderness trip leader, we used stress and really looked for ways to use the wilderness to create stress for each individual in a way that would maximize their learning but not be so high that it would push them over that knife edge of most intense learning into a decompensating place where stress was actually harmful for them. And so we would use mountain climbing and 35-hour bushwhacking trips through the wilderness and a lot of other things to create possibilities where people could get to that knife edge where they could learn as much as possible because the stress was high, but it was challenge stress and not toxic stress. And so I think all of us benefit from looking at our lives and looking for where are the places that we are experiencing toxic stress that we are not managing with as much self-care and efforts at well-being as we can, or placing boundaries on our exposure to those kinds of toxic stress versus using the challenge stress that really allows us to grow and learn and expand our capacities to manage stressful situations. Certainly people that do well learn how to manage stress very well. In the study of these people, I can't tell you how often I've seen people have to change their relationship to stress. They change their relationships. They begin putting boundaries on relationships. They begin saying, one of the most common things that people say to me is, it took an illness for me to realize that I've been spending much of my life taking care of the needs or perceived expectations of others instead of also attending to my own well-being, my own dreams, my own real needs in terms of being the best that I can be.
Dr. Rediger, I wonder if you could describe the case of Daniel and his metastatic testicular cancer. What was it about the specter of death that freed him to live?
That's a great story, and it's one that's been very instructive to me. Dan was a seminarian. What's fascinating about his story is that you had very good medical documentation of his diagnosis and accurate diagnosis. And you also had him being followed by a psychiatrist from before the illness through the remission. And the documentation of both what was going on in his body and in his mind is a fascinating story. And it can be found at the Institute of Noetic Sciences website. And the story basically was a tragic tale of testicular cancer. This is a guy who had been raised in an abusive environment, a very difficult situation where he, at a deep level, questioned his own ability to be good enough, both for love and work. Freud defined mental health as our capacity to love and work, to sustain long-term, meaningful, loving relationships and also work productively in the world. This is a guy who struggled with both love and work. He was ambivalent in his relationship with his girlfriend. He was in seminary. He could not commit to a career, and yet he wanted to be a minister. Through the long evolution of being diagnosed with a cancer and then facing his mortality, he became ill to the point where he only had a few weeks to live, and he was asked by his therapist at the time, what did he want to do before he died? And he decided he wanted to get married and be ordained. And so he walked down the wedding aisle, gaunt, looking like a specter of death, frankly, with this massive tumor coming out of his neck at that point. And what's fascinating is, in the period of days after getting married, after making this commitment to marriage and ordination, he found this life in him where he really wanted to live. He had this session with his therapist, and in the session felt the deep love of his grandmother, who had always been unconditionally loving towards him. And she was deceased, but in feeling again how much she loved him and cared for him, he found this desire to live and love welling up in him. And although I'm shortening this story in terms of a lot of the details, I think that re-experiencing the abiding and unconditional love of his grandmother was really important for him. He felt it at a deep level. And then embracing his new life and marriage with his wife and his commitment to being ordained, I think all of this had a deep effect on his psyche. And watching the rapidity with which the tumor melted is a truly astonishing story. And I don't want to make light and pretend these are easy stories. These were deep shifts in his mind and body and character. But again, I study the ultimate achievers in health, and they show in very intense situations what's possible for all of us.
Dr. Rediger, you have talked a lot about the immune system and how important it is for our healing. Dr. Steven Rosenberg is easily one of the world's foremost cancer researchers and immunologists. Can you please tell us a little bit about his patient with the bad gallbladder?
Yes. Great story. So this is a story about how spontaneous remission helped spark a lifelong trajectory and a whole new area of investigation for us. He was a young, very bright surgical resident many years ago, and a gentleman came in with stomach cancer. This gentleman came in and needed a fairly minor operation, I think it was a cholecystectomy, to have his gallbladder removed. And he casually told Dr. Rosenberg that he'd had gastric cancer some years before. Dr. Rosenberg doubted that that was true because he knew the person would not be alive if that was a true and correct diagnosis. When he took out the gallbladder, he palpated the liver, and he noticed that the liver looked healthy and smooth, the way a healthy liver should look. And he went back, and if I recall the details correctly, he looked at the old pathology report where the liver had been diagnosed correctly with liver cancer, and the liver had been really riddled with tumors and very lumpy and looked very diseased. So he was shocked. This man had an accurate diagnosis, and here he was many years later, this old alcoholic person who just had not been recognized in medicine for what had actually transpired for him. And so, of course, I think his first question was, well, this guy's an alcoholic. What does he drink? And so, but the mystery of this whole story caused him to think, well, if this is possible for this man, it must be possible for others. And it sent him on a lifelong quest to figure out if there's a way to activate the immune system so that the immune system, with all of its complex, specialized battalions, could do its job better. And he is one of the major founders, as you indicated, of immunotherapy. And he has developed brilliant new strategies that instead of suppressing the immune system, he's been one of the leading scientific voices for helping us use the immune system better. So that's a great story about how a case of spontaneous remission helped inspire a whole new way of thinking about health and well-being.
Dr. Rediger, I wonder if there are commonalities among the ultimate achievers that you've been studying. Are there lessons that the rest of us can take away?
Yes, I think so. I think every story is different, and so I purposely tell the stories in the book of people who had different trajectories. I think that the personal is most universal, and so when we go deeply into these stories, we often find nuggets that are very important and can be life-changing for us. And so I purposefully try to show not only the similarities between the stories but also the differences. And I think that's how we begin mapping this new area. I think there's 4 basic pillars of health and vitality and well-being that are important for all of us to understand. I do talk about genuine nutrition in the book. I talk about nutritional density, about understanding what nutrition is apart from the messages we get in the culture, and how what we are told is healthy may not be healthy. I do refer to a book called Eat to Live by Joel Fuhrman that I think is an outstanding guide for what's healthy. I also talk about how I don't believe that one particular approach to nutrition fits all. We all have different microbiomes. We have different ancestries. We have different parts of the world we live in, and it's important to understand the nuances of that and build a nutritional plan that is life-giving for you, that eliminates processed foods in general, but also understands that nutrition is part of the story but not the whole story. 88% of people who do have these spontaneous remissions do go vegetarian, but I purposely tell the story in the book of a gentleman, Pablo, who got better from glioblastoma multiforme with a diet that was more about ketosis. And I also tell the story purposefully of people who did not pay attention to diet and they still got better. So nutrition is one thing. Another thing is the immune system, which we've touched on, how to activate and empower the immune system. I tell the story of the whole lifelong debate between Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp about whether it's important to nuke the germ with an antibiotic or if it's more important to take care of the microbiome. Antoine Béchamp's claim and argument was that a disease, that the presence of bacteria is a sign of a body that's broken down. It's not the cause of the body being broken down. And so he views bacterial infections as being a breakdown in the body. And he said, do you want to swat flies away from a heap of trash, or do you want to just remove the trash? And he then, this is the day when cholera was a terrible epidemic. In front of his students, he drank a glass of cholera and told them he wouldn't get ill because he knew how to take care of the immune system. And lo and behold, he did not get ill. On his deathbed, according to the biographer who was the son-in-law of Pasteur, Pasteur said that Béchamp was right. The bacteria are nothing. The terrain, in other words, what we now call the microbiome is everything. And so that's a very different approach than just nuke the germ. I'm interested in antibiotics because I see them save lives every day, but it's not the whole story and it's not the most important story. The third area, the third pillar we've talked about is stress. And We can go into more detail on that another time, but knowing how to manage stress so that it helps vitalize your mind and body and not wear it down is important. The biggest pillar of health, according to my research, really deals with the issues of belief and identity. We are all a complex composite of true and false, empowering and disempowering beliefs. For the most part, we've collected these beliefs since childhood and with all of our experiences and perceptions and interpretations of our experiences, and these are mostly unexamined beliefs. I have had to begin coming to terms with the reality that when we change our beliefs at a deep level, when we empower and strengthen true beliefs and eliminate false beliefs, we create a different physiology in our body and a different possibility at times. That's a really big topic, but there it is.
Dr. Jeffrey Rediger, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's been an honor. Thank you, both of you, for asking such great questions.
You've been listening to Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a psychiatrist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. He is chief of behavioral medicine at Caritas Good Samaritan Medical Center. The book he wrote is Cured, the Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing.
Terry, I really appreciate Dr. Rediger's 4 pillars, the first one being a nutritional plan for you. You know, someone else may have a completely different nutritional plan, but you've got to find the one that works best for you.
Absolutely. And then activate and empower your immune system.
Yeah, he talked about the terrain, and it reminds me of Dr. David Servan-Schreiber, who we interviewed many, many years ago, a neuroscientist, and he had brain cancer, glioblastoma. He eventually died, but he lived way longer than the predictions. He talked about the concept of the terrain, how important it is. That's your body's soil.
Exactly right. And one thing that's very important in taking care of your body is stress management.
And, of course, belief and identity and how important those beliefs are. That's basically medical anthropology.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
And by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoa flavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1199. The number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can share your thoughts about today's show. If you have had an experience with spontaneous healing or you know someone who has, we'd love to hear about it.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another episode, and you can share it with a friend. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show
without you.